Okay, I think we can go ahead and get started, and then hopefully if people trickle in, we can have them have seats on the side. Good evening, everyone. My name is Elizabeth King. I am currently the director of the Center for Russian, East European, Eurasian Studies here at University of Michigan at the International Institute. And I'm happy to welcome you all here for our event today, War and Punishment, Putin, Zelenskyy, and the Path to Russia's Invasion of Ukraine, by Mikhail Zygar. I also want to thank the Wallace House Center for Journalists for co-sponsoring, and the Knight Wallace Fellows for also who were able to attend to be here with us today. Just a couple of housekeeping items for how the evening will proceed. Mikhail will give a talk, and then we'll follow it with Q&A. We have 2 microphones set up, one on each side of the auditorium, so you can stand in queue to ask a question. I do ask that when you ask before you ask your question, you briefly tell us your name, affiliation, and then ask your question. And then after the Q&A session, I'll also let you know that there'll be a book signing. Mikhail will be here in the auditorium. If you didn't have a chance to purchase the book and you want to purchase one of his books, Literati has a table outside the auditorium as well. I also just wanted to take this quick opportunity to let you know of 2 upcoming events that CREASE is hosting. Next Wednesday, we'll return to our normally scheduled noon lecture series, where we have Dr. Togjan Kasinova, who will give a lecture on atomic step, how Kazakhstan gave up the bomb. And then on Wednesday, April 3rd at 5:30 p.m., we'll be joined by Yelena Kostuchenko, who will give a book talk on her new book, I Love Russia, as well. And tonight, I'm very honored to introduce you to our CREASE guest, Mikhail Zygar. Mikhail is a Russian-born author and political journalist. He was the founding editor-in-chief of TV Rain, Dozhd. And then in 2022, Zygar authored a petition against Russia's invasion of Ukraine, signed by prominent Russian intellectuals. And thus, in March of that year, he organized the only interview of President Zelenskyy for an independent Russian media. He's currently residing in New York as the inaugural Press Freedom Fellow at the Craig Newmark Graduate School of Journalism at the City University of New York, and is a visiting lecturer at the Princeton School of Public and International Affairs. He was also recently appointed a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Center. Mikhail currently writes as a columnist for Die Spiegel and the New York Times, and he hosts a series of interviews on YouTube titled The Empire Must Die, with guests he regards as, quote, humanity's brightest minds. Mikhail Zygar has authored investigative studies resulting in books such as All the Kremlin's Men, Inside the Court of Vladimir Putin, The Empire Must Die, Russia's Revolutionary Collapse, 1900 to 1917, and his newest book, which we're going to hear more about, War and Punishment, Putin, Zelenskyy, and the Path to Russia's Invasion of Ukraine. Please join me in welcoming Mikhail Zygar.
Thanks so much. I hope it works. Yeah, it's a privilege and honor for me to be part of our criminal meeting tonight. I mean criminal because just today I was officially indicted by Russian authorities. So now I'm a criminal, and you are probably my accomplices now. Thank you for coming. I must explain how I come to this happy day and to tell you something about my criminal activities, probably. So a few years ago, I realized that a lot of people, a lot of Russian politicians and high-ranking Russian bureaucrats are obsessed with history. It was approximately 15 years ago, the moment when I started writing my book, All the Kremlin's Men. And I realized that sometimes it was hard for me to persuade them to talk to me as a journalist, because that time I was editor-in-chief of TV Rain, or Dozhd, Russia's only independent news TV channel. So I had to explain that this book is not about the news. It's not about it's not a piece of journalism. It's about history. And my objective was to write something for those generations who are going to live in Russia or outside of Russia in 100 years. Because those people need our explanation, what was happening in Russia, what was in the minds of the politicians, or the oligarchs, of those decision makers who made all that mess. And and when I said that mantra, every time with every newsmaker, with every source, I realized that that person changed, and he started feeling better. He would realize that, yes, indeed, I'm a historical character. I'm not just a regular Russian bureaucrat. And he loved speaking of himself as a historical character, and that would mean that he would say terrible things about his fellow politicians, fellow bureaucrats, and he would explain that he is not like all of them. He is much better. He is real statesman. I'm sorry, most of those people were men. One of the conversation I had was remarkable because obviously all of them were all of them had very specific opinions about Russian history. Most of them used to say that obviously Russia is predetermined to be a dictatorship. Yes, obviously Russia has its unique path. And yes, Russia is doomed to be a great empire and there is no other way. And every time I was really pissed off with all those theories. I hate all those theories. But I had to stay silent and just to keep asking questions. And one of my sources who really loved history would start speaking about magical numbers and about certain historical cycles. And as we spoke in 2013, he said, yes, yeah, obviously, just like in 1913, that was the last year of the peace, and Russia was doomed to face the First World War, and now we are doomed to face another World War, and probably it's going to happen next year, 2014. In Moscow in 2013, that was unimaginable. And I did not believe, but I kept on asking him, what kind of the world war could start in 2014? And he started explaining in a very bizarre way, as it seemed to me that time. He said something like, Putin understands that we don't have any chance if we continue that kind of competition against the West. We don't have chances to compete with them economically. There is no way for us to win that rivalry technologically. The only way out is to stop playing that game and to turn over the chessboard. We need to break all the rules, and that's the only tiny opportunity for Russia to become great again, to become great empire again. I cannot say that I was scared because it seemed 100% improbable for me. But then next year when Crimea was occupied, and after that when Russia invaded East Ukraine, I realized that probably, definitely, that was not a strategy. That forecast I've heard from that high-ranking member of Russian government, it was not the plan he decided to share with me. That was just his analysis. That was his expectation. He was not from a group of Russian warmongers. On the contrary, he was very liberal bureaucrat from the Russian government. But he shared the feelings, the emotions of his colleagues, and he was trying to share his ideas about Putin's feelings. So in few years, I decided to quit TV Rain, and I focused my attention on covering history, because I thought that yeah, it's really important. It's really important, the way how we perceive Russia's history, the way how we teach history is very important, because history is the way how we can shape values. And I think that values of many Russians are shaped by the historical narrative people are taught in schools. And I've written the book that is called The Empire Must Die, and I think that for me it was really important to write that book, because I was trying to prove that Russia is not doomed to be dictatorship, and there is no such a way as unique Russia's path, and there are no national characters. And every time when I hear someone saying that, you know, Russians have the national character, they need a czar, you know, that's genetical, that was predetermined. I want to ask about Koreans, because probably North Koreans have national character that demands a dictatorship, and South Koreans have completely different national character, and that makes them a democracy. Okay, so. And while I was writing more about history, I was creating new projects, online projects about history. At the same time, I was watching how the historical views and how the attention of Russian bureaucracy and Russian politicians to history was evolving. So after I published my book, The Empire Must Die, about the Russian Revolution of 1917, I realized from my sources that that was a very risky business, because any commemoration of the Russian Revolution of 1917 was completely forbidden in Russia. And the decision was taken by President Putin himself, because he is the historian-in-chief, and he's got very sad perception of Russian history, and it's correct. He knows that he is correct in his historical views. So it was his decision to avoid any kind of, not to say celebration, but a commemoration of the anniversary of Russian Revolution. But then I started, unfortunately, reading so-called articles. He started writing about history, and that was much worse. His first article about history was written in 2020, and that was a very remarkable piece, because it was we know that during COVID his behavior changed a lot. He locked himself up in his residency in Valdai. He was not alone. He spent most of his lockdown together with his best friend Yuri Kovalchuk, the person he knows very well since the beginning of 90s, the person who could be considered to be Russia's only real oligarch, because he is the only businessman who's got a lot of influence over the government and President Putin himself. Kovalchuk owns all Russian independent media, including First TV channel, including independent media, I mean private media. All Russian private media are literally owned by the same person. They are very dependent on him. Yeah, and but what's important, Yuri Kovalchuk is the son of a renowned Soviet academician, one very important Soviet historian, Valentin Kovalchuk the senior, who was the member of the Soviet Academy of Sciences. And now you guess what was his specialization. He was writing his books about history of Crimea and Sebastopol. So obsession of Mr. Putin and his friend Yuri Kovalchuk with history of Crimea definitely should be explained with that historical background and with the preparation from Kovalchuk the senior. And right that summer, after that long isolation, after that summer, those two men spent in Valdai residency, they created jointly with help of their ghostwriter, whose name is Vladimir Medinsky, who used to be Russia's Minister of Culture. They created first article about Russia's history. Partially, it was repeated by him in his interview with Tucker Carlson. I hope you haven't seen it, because I really value your time and your nerves. But for those who have seen it, yes, the idea that Poland made Hitler invaded, that's exactly from that article. But something worse happened the next year, in 2021. Medinsky wrote another article published, authored by Putin, and that was the article about the history of Ukraine. And actually, after that article published in August 2021, it was clear that another war is being prepared, because that article explained all of his prejudice. He took from his Ukrainian friends. One of them is obviously Kovalchuk, whose father, Soviet historian, was born in Ukraine, and who never spoke Ukraine, and who could always explain to him that Ukrainian language does not exist and there is no such people as Ukrainian people. But which was important, that article about history of Ukraine, it has all those new historical myths, like Ukrainian did not exist and it was invented by Lenin. Now we know all those myths by heart, but mostly, and what is worse, it was based on traditional Russian historical narrative. It was not that far from our textbooks. It was not that far from the way how history of Russian Empire has always been taught. And actually, that was the moment when I realized that I had to write the book about history of Ukraine. Or I'm not Ukrainian. I'm not a Ukrainian author. I'm not supposed to write about Ukraine. I'm supposed to write about history of Russia. And especially, unfortunately, only after the beginning of the full-scale invasion, I realized that we've got a huge problems with our history. That we don't really have history of the Russian people. I remember that many years ago, when I was reading stories about how Karamzin, the father of Russian historiography, when he has just finished his huge work called The History of Russian State, he was widely criticized by his friends, who asked him, why History of Russian State? It should have been called History of the Russian People. And one of his competitors even wrote another book called The History of Russian People. But actually, we don't have that. The traditional historical narrative that has always existed in Russia was actually written not even by historians. I don't want to insult anyone, but obviously they were historical propagandists. They worked for the state. Even Nikolai Karamzin was the official historiographer of the court of His Imperial Majesty Alexander I. So were those historians who were his predecessors. And so I realized that I have to unveil those traditional historical myths that created that imperial narrative. That narrative that does not include any other place in Russia except for Moscow or St. Petersburg. That narrative that is always focused on the emperor or general secretary or the president. We don't know anything about majority of Russians. Even more, we somehow learning about Russian history, we have very strange approach as if it's sport, because we always have to root for someone, because there is always our team, and we support it, and there is another team, like Tatars. They are enemies, and like we are rooting for Muscovites, but actually Tatars are also our ancestors. If we're reading or writing history of Russia, like both Golden Horde is the great empire of the past, and the whole territory of Golden Horde is on the Russian on the territory of current Russian Federation. Why we don't consider that country to be part of our ancestry and part of our legacy? Or Novgorod, Novgorod Republic, which was completely different political system from Moscow. Republican system. It was its political system was equal to the Republic of Venice. It was much more democratic, obviously. The parliament in Novgorod existed almost started working almost the same time as the parliament in London, and actually Novgorod was completely the political system in Novgorod was completely destroyed. Couple of decades after by Ivan III, couple of decades after the moment when Constantinople was invaded by Turks, and if we compare the cruelty of Sultan Mehmed in Constantinople and Prince Ivan III in Novgorod, Russians killing Muscovites killing Novgorodians were much more cruel. And actually they did not consider themselves to be Russians and Russians, because people from Novgorod spoke another language. Now we call it Novgorodian dialect, but it's just a very comfortable synonym. Obviously that was different language, and Novgorodian language is much closer to Polish language, to the contemporary Polish language, than to our Russian language. So to have another perception of Russia, and probably to have to start thinking about Russia in a different way, we probably need to have a lot of different historical narratives of Russia. We need to understand that Russia is not Moscow. Russian history is not history of Moscow. It has always been almost a crime to call Russia a colonial empire. Most Russian historians, especially during the 20th century, would start arguing that no, colonial empire is British empire, because colonies, they are beyond the ocean. We cannot consider all those territories invaded by Russia as Russian colonies. And no, Russia didn't have colonies beyond the ocean. First, Russia did. There is such place as Alaska, which is obviously not in Eurasia. But actually, Siberia was colonized by Russians, by Muscovites, the same years and with the same methods, completely the same, as North America was colonized by British and French. There is no difference in that historical process, and for real historians, that's not even a question. But that's a very painful issue for a lot of Russians, and I think we are just in the beginning of that long process, of the process of trying to accept and to acknowledge the fact that we know quite little about Russia's history. Unfortunately, we missed the opportunity to press that reset button and to start learning Russia's history over again after 1991, because that was a great opportunity. But in 1991, Russian thinkers, scholars, historians, authors took a great effort to start speaking truth about the history of the 20th century, about Soviet Union, about Bolsheviks, about Lenin, Stalin, but actually no one dared to question the full story, to ask questions and to start rewriting or rethinking, reanalyzing the history of the Russian Empire. And I think that's only our future. I strongly believe that it will happen. I strongly believe that without understanding our history, we won't be able to understand what's our future. I do not believe that history can repeat itself, but I believe that history can shape the values of the generations, and I would love the future generations of Russians to be free of all those historical myths and all those historical stereotypes that a lot of people share and that President Putin believes in, because most of his myths, including those he told to Tucker Carlson, that's not his invention. He took them from our history books. So I hope that my book about those myths of Russian history is the beginning of that process of trying to understand what happened to us and how we came to that terrible situation, and how all those it also tells how all those historical myths are being used by the politicians, in Moscow. I hope it will be useful, and I will be really happy to answer your questions, not only about history, but about any other criminal case I know something about. Thanks so much. There are 2 microphones.
If you have a chance to pull back on the myths in Russian history, which would be the first one that you would expose for Russian people, if there's a possibility?
At least I can. I didn't do that, but I can tell you about 7 myths I have in this book. For example, the first myth is about the unity of Russia and Ukraine, and about that Russians and Ukrainians are the same people. It's pretty new. It was invented in 17th century, and it was deliberately invented by a person whose name is Innocenty Gizel. He was a German monk who worked in Kiev, in Kiev-Pechersk monastery, and that was kind of political trick from his side. He wanted to persuade Russian Tsar Alexis to be a political ally for Ukraine, and as you may imagine, you may not. you would not believe that Russia at that time didn't want to have active and aggressive foreign policy, because all those times of trouble were still very fresh in the memories, and Polish invasion of 1613 was also very fresh. So Russian Tsar didn't want to have a war against Poland for Ukraine. So the book written by Innocenty Gizel, offering that artificial historical narrative and connecting Kiev to Moscow, was a part of that political propaganda needed to arrange the political alliance. There are several other important historical myths about Russia and Ukraine. For example, the second myth about the betrayal of Hetman Mazepa, who is, until now, is considered to be the traitor by all Russians, by all in traditional Russian culture, on Russian television, in all the propaganda talk shows, we can still hear his name, and that is like a curse. And you know, last year when I was touring with this book in Edinburgh, in Scotland, I was traveling with my daughter, and I wanted to show her some movie about Scottish history. Definitely, I chose the Hollywood movie made by Mel Gibson.
Braveheart?
Braveheart, yes. But still, it's about Scotland, yeah. And suddenly I realized that the main heroes, both main heroes, William Wallace and Robert Bruce, if they were Ukraine, like the situation is very close. There is there are two countries. One of them wants to control another, but those leaders of the breakaway rebellious nation don't want to be part of the big empire and fight against the monarch. Actually, if they were Ukrainians, they would have been traitors forever. And actually, Robert Bruce is exactly the same. He's got the same destiny as Ivan Mazepa, because yes, in the beginning of his biography, he was loyal servant of the English king, and then he started the rebellion, and the rebellion was successful, and he became King of Scots. So, but actually, if in England today, no one thought to protest against Braveheart as a movie that is glorifying Scottish separatists and traitors. It's unimaginable, because sometimes history is history. In Russia, somehow history is still alive, and all those historical wounds created 300 years ago are still kept very alive and very bleeding. And it's interesting that the myth of that great betrayal of Mazepa was also invented by another Ukrainian author whose name was Feofan Prokopovich, who was hired by Peter the Great and who was brought from Kiev to St. Petersburg, because that time Kiev was the center of the education. There was no university, neither in Moscow nor in St. Petersburg, but there was academia, Kiev Mohila Academy in Kiev. So all the educated people, all the high-ranking officials and scholars who came to St. Petersburg were mostly Ukrainians. So Feofan Prokopovich, the person hired to be the ideologist of Russian Empire, was Ukrainian, and his assignment was to blame Ivan Mazepa for the troubles of Peter the Great, and he did a great job. I can continue the list. There is an important myth about Crimea. Crimea as the cradle of Russian civilization, a very important place for all Russians. It was Turkish till the 18th century. So it was conquered by by Prince Potemkin only in late 18th century, and that was funny. The idea was in a way it was a hint from Voltaire, who didn't like Turks, and he wanted Catherine the Great to be to create the great empire with the capital of Constantinople, and he was urging her and Prince Potemkin to take over Constantinople, to invade Ottoman Empire, and that was so-called Greek project. So it's amazing that they were really obsessed with that idea, and Potemkin was ironically in our memories in Russia today, he's known only as a lover of Catherine the Great, but that time he was really ideologically very important, because he was the main proponent of Russia as a colonial empire, and he was inspired by Voltaire. There is very important myth about Ukrainian language that does not exist, or is the same language as Russian, and it's very important that we've got two very well-known examples. One of them is Nikolai Gogol, another is Taras Shevchenko. Gogol is one of many Ukrainians who was Ukrainian speaking, and who came to St. Petersburg as a Ukrainian speaking person, and he was one of many Ukrainians there, because the average level of education still, even in the beginning of 19th century in Ukraine, was higher than in most of Russia. So a lot of bureaucrats, a lot of officers in the army were from Ukrainian origin, but there was one major condition for all of them to reach any high position in the army or in the government. They had to abandon their Ukrainian identity. They had to stop speaking Ukrainian and to embrace the fact that from now on they were Russians. And so actually, so did Gogol. His first short stories are written in the mixture of Ukrainian and Russian. If we read them now, it's clear that it's real mixture. But after that, he stopped thinking in that way, and he preferred to be popular writer in St. Petersburg. And for Shevchenko, that was his principal choice. He decided that he doesn't want to be one of those, and he's mocking all of his compatriots in many of his poems, because of the fact that in one of his poems, which was the reason for his indictment and for sending him in exile, one of the most powerful poems he wrote, it's called The Dream, and he talks to other Ukrainians from St. Petersburg, and they offer him some help, and they ask him, can you speak Russian like a normal person? And he says, yeah, I can, but I don't want to. And he's really making fun of Ukrainians who stopped being Ukrainians for the sake of earning money, who betrayed their motherland. And actually, it happened right during the lifetime of Taras Shevchenko, when due to the uprising in Poland, the national policy in the Russian Empire has changed greatly. And in the middle of the 19th century, all the national schools, and specifically the Ukrainian schools, were banned in Russia. And publishing of Ukrainian books and Ukrainian textbooks was banned. And so it was this disproportion in today's Ukraine we see is the consequence of that policy of 19th century, because as we know, western part of Ukraine was a part of the Austrian Empire, eastern part of Ukraine was part of Russian Empire, and there were no obstacles to printing books in Ukrainian or studying Ukrainian in the Austrian part, and it was completely banned in the Russian part. But at the same time, most authors, most journalists, writers, scientists lived in the eastern part of Ukraine, but they had only one opportunity to be published or to study or to teach. They had to go to Lviv, to the western part. So in a way, that the fact that Ukraine was divided made it culturally unified, because two parts had to stick to one another. And it was obvious for the Western Ukraine that most authors, most intellectuals were coming from the East, but for Easterners that was clear that they needed the West, because that was the only possibility to breathe and to be heard. I won't stop at the myth that Lenin invented Ukraine. It's just pathetic. It's really funny. No, Ukraine existed many years before that. But I love all the myths about Stepan Bandera that are now widely used by Russian television. First, because it's funny that those Ukro-Nazis, or Banderites as they are called now by Russian television, they existed even before Stepan Bandera, but they were called in a different way, because before that they were named after Simon Petlura, who was the leader of the Ukrainian nationalists during the civil war, and they were called Petlurites. And before that, they were named after Ivan Mazepa. They were called Mazepites. So actually, even in Bulgakov's White Guard, you can find all those names, including Mazepinцы. That's the same label, the same way how Ukrainian nationalists were labeled that time. And speaking about Stepan Bandera, in this book, War and Punishment, I describe how Bandera has become such a superstar in Russia today. That happened mostly because Putin knows who is Bandera almost from his childhood, because you cannot believe that, or maybe you can, but Bandera was a very important character of the popular novel published in the Soviet Union in 1970s. That novel was called The Third Card, and it was written by Yulian Semyonov, who was one of the most popular Soviet spy novel writers. The previous novel of this series was called the 17 Moments of Spring. It was the best-known Soviet TV series about Stirlitz, the great Soviet spy who was spying on Nazi Germany. But in the sequel of that novel, in the Third Card, Stirlitz was fighting against Bandera. And Bandera was the main villain of that novel, and we know for sure, Vladimir Putin has has admitted that number of times that was his favorite character when he was young. That was his favorite movie, and that movie and all those books inspired him to start dreaming of becoming a KGB officer. So yes, obviously he knows the third card by heart, and he knows from his childhood that Bandera is the most terrible person, because he was Stilitz's the enemy of Stilitz. So that's I guess quite. If it could be funny, that's funny that sometimes political prejudice has such a ridiculous source.
Thank you.
Thank you for your question.
Hi. Thank you, Mikhail, for the talk. I can't but agree with you that Russia definitely needs the history of Russian people rather than the Russian state. But in this spirit, I'm wondering, to what degree do you think the Russian people's attitudes, thoughts are driven by history? So you wrote a book about the elites, right? Is it the same situation with the Russian people, or is it different?
Thank you. You're absolutely right. I think that we had the unique historical moment. We had a couple of decades when history has become much less popular, much less important, because normally mostly those nations, those countries who are not. Who don't have economic success. They need the feeling of national pride as a painkiller. But since the beginning of this century, the high oil prices, the economic development, the new way of life, actually the new middle class that exists in Russia, and the fact that a lot of people started for the first time in Russian history, enjoying life, that's the unique moment when actually a lot of people don't need that painkiller as necessity to be proud of your great empire, as necessity of being reminded on a daily basis that we can destroy the whole world. And definitely we have seen the 10 years, 12 years of very aggressive imperialist propaganda, and it was not. I think that for many years it was not successful, because it was not needed. There was no real demand for that, because a lot of people till now they have a lot of their own interests, their own issues, their own choices, and probably that's one of the reasons for the way how Russians right now react to the war. In 2022, we saw that there was no one willing to go and sacrifice their lives for the great Russian Empire. Yevgeny Prigozhin had to tour across Russian prisons to recruit volunteers, because there were no people willing to go to the war, because there was no that huge wave of patriotism that could draw people to the front line. And I think that's the proof that it's that obsession with history is, and that obsession with imperial jingoism is very artificial, and it's not shared by a lot of Russians, at least so far. I'm afraid that the trend is very disturbing. Definitely that mindset is shared by veterans of KGB and by some part of the older generations of those people who lived in the Soviet Union and who felt frustrated but it's not so so widespread as it has always been. Thank you.
Thanks. I have a question. How do you see yourself now in this historical moment? And do you see yourself like one of many Russians who, throughout centuries, had to leave? And what's next for you? Thank you.
Thank you. It's a hard question. I try not to compare. I don't think that there are historical parallels. I try not to compare myself in our generation of Russian immigrants to the previous generations, especially to the generation of the beginning of the 20th century, because everything is different. And for example, yes, we know that those people were very naive, and they thought that they were going to come back to Russia very soon. That Bolsheviks are just for a few years, and it's going to be okay. I think that a lot of people in Russia had the same illusion in the beginning of the war. I did not. Unlike that generation, I think that our role and our connection with people in Russia is stronger, because obviously I think that that Russian independent media in exile and all Russians who produce some kind of intellectual content, they are needed, because the independent media in exile is the only institution that connects Russia, inner Russia and outer Russia. It's really it connects all the people, no matter where they live, in America or in Bali or in Moscow or in Siberia. So I think what we do now is not meaningless. We are in a much more privileged situation than Soviet dissidents who could use samizdat as the best way to spread their ideas. Internet, YouTube is much better. I could publish my book in Russian, and it's available for free in Medusa's application, which is the most popular web mobile application in Russia. So it's possible to read it for anyone who is in Russia, and that's the amazing reach compared to what was available for Soviet dissidents. I don't have the answer for the future, because I think that that's a long journey. I think that there is an opportunity for Russia to become a normal country. I remember that several years ago, I was making a documentary for Al Jazeera, and I had to interview a lot of people, including Alexei Navalny, including hierarchs from Russian Orthodox Church, and including Margarita Simonyan. And I remember when we were talking to Margarita Simonyan, that's against my principles. I never start arguing during the interview, because I think that's counterproductive. But she was so arrogant and so stupid. So I started. She was saying that we should not, that we will die as civilization if we lose our sovereignty, and I was going to start asking her why she thought we were going to die, and she said, "Okay, I see. You want us to be like Canada." And I said, "Yes, exactly. That's exactly what I want." I want us to be like Canada. And for her, that was like worse than death. Like Canada does not exist, obviously. It's so yeah, I think that we have the possibility to become Canada, and that would be the best scenario. But there is a long journey to our future Canada. I have that after I left Russia in 2022. I lived for a year and a half in Germany, in Berlin, and every time I used the opportunity to talk to people about their own family stories, how denazification influence, or how their families struggled with the consequences of the war. Dozens of times I've heard the phrase, but grandfather remained Nazi till his death. But the most popular story I've heard, what people believe, that the real denazification happened in 70s due to the American TV series called Holocaust with Meryl Streep. Because that was the moment when the next generation who did not live during the war and who were absolutely free of all prejudice and all personal emotions about the war, they learned the story and they had an opportunity to make their own conclusions, and they were able to be free from all those demons from the history, and they were really sorry. They were really traumatized by the horror of Third Reich. But for the previous generations, that was still a taboo, and they could not talk about it. They could not get rid of that burden of history. So I'm afraid that we need 25 years after the end of the current war, so the new generation would be completely free, and they would start building the Canada.
Short version of my question is, what now? At the beginning of your talk, you mentioned that in 2013, you believed it was ridiculous to talk about the next world war. And the entire focus of your talk, the way I see it, is about the importance of history for the Russian culture and the Russians. And since that mostly is the history of imperial expansion, what scenarios do you envision happening now? You know, during the Warsaw Pact times, Russia bordered with Western Germany. Is it likely to move to regain that territory and that power?
Thank you. I do not believe that Russia needs more territory. So I know that they don't believe. They don't want territory. So this war is not for new territory in Ukraine. It's not about that. It's about principles, and actually they really mean it when they say that it's a war against the West, not against Ukraine. And in the beginning of your question, you asked me about the world today. So I think if we're trying to analyze the world today, it's not only about Russia. And what's happening in Russia also depends not only on Putin, but on many people, including two current candidates for the American presidency. And I think what's going to happen in November is very important for everyone. And yes, I think that the imperial mindset is a threat, obviously, for any country. And in some countries, the politicians manage to overcome it. In in Britain 100 years ago, it was already clear that Kipling might be a great poet, but not really great thinker. And White Man's Burden was considered to be a shameful way of describing the world. And it was long time ago, and so that intellectual work, that intellectual homework has been made, but still there is some place to go. In some countries, it's much less successful. France, for example, I think I've been recently to Napoleon's museum in Paris, and it's amazing. So there are no remorses, and like Napoleon was the founding father of the European Union, and those treacherous Europeans, they didn't get it. They betrayed his vision. So it's amazing that for at least for those people in Paris who work for the Historical Military Museum, it's still there. The ideas of the sacred French Empire are not that. So it's always dangerous. So I think that what's happening in America will affect what's happening in Russia. Putin, we definitely know what's Putin's dream. He wants New Yalta. He wants another world order. He wants a new summit with Donald Trump and Xi Jinping, and he wants to divide the world and to have his huge part. But he needs he would call it respect. Yeah, but that's obviously, and he realizes that Donald Trump is probably the only person who can give him that. Thank you.
Gail, thank you for your talk. I wanted to ask you about how do you see the role of Russian diaspora living all over the world in helping to take the empire down, and if there is anything Russian living abroad can do, and what's lacking? Because for now it seems like Ukrainians are doing heavy lifting with this, with fighting the empire. But it seems like that Russian people, they who live in a free world can contribute to the struggle. I really appreciate your book, Taking Down the Myth, but I don't see a lot of movement among the people, a lot of demonstration, a lot of protesting by Russian embassy. If you can talk a little bit about it, the nature of this phenomenon, I would appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm not sure that the protest rallies next to the Russian embassies are very effective. And I cannot blame Russians who live abroad for not going to the streets and squares, because it's rather easy to go to protest next to the embassy in Washington or in Berlin. You don't risk anything, and it doesn't help those Russians who live inside the country. It doesn't help Ukrainians who fight. And yeah, it's the most difficult question. I do think every time I think there is very important for me. It's very clear when I hear the question why Russians don't overthrow Putin. Why cannot they be braver and just to try to do something? I think I know the answer, and it's so very clear, because during the last years, during the last 30 years after the collapse of Soviet Union at least, we learned to hate the violence. That's somehow, and in that way, a lot of people in Russia, most people in Russia are not very different from most people in Europe. People they are not used to violence. They're not ready to take guns and to go and to fight and to sacrifice their lives. And that's the way of thinking most of us embraced during the peaceful years of after the collapse, after the end of the Cold War. That's the way how a lot of people feel, because they have families, they have wonderful dreams, they have their own space, they don't want to think even about politics, about wars, about army, because that's the way how they were grown up. That's the way how they were taught by their parents. That's their values. They don't want the violence. So I cannot imagine any rebellion in Russia, because I know that those people who love violence, they love other type of violence. They would go to fight in Ukraine for the empire, and I don't really understand how many Russians can change their not their mind, but their mindset, and what Russians abroad are the same people. They are even more liberal, more tender in that way. But as I think the only opportunity is to I received I just in case I apologize, because you have to hear that story for the second time. So I received the letter from Alexei Navalny just about a week before his death, 5 days probably. And among other topics, he was encouraging me and all other immigrants to continue living, to integrate, to learn languages, to work, and not to be part of Russian diaspora, not to be confined in some little groups of miserable people who lost Russia and cannot live without thinking of it. Because his idea was that our probably if we cannot fight right now, we should survive. We should be strong enough to fight the moment when we have to. We have to be strong enough, probably one day, to come back to Russia and to try to build the real civil society. Probably there is a possibility of that day. Who knows? I remember that I was, I believe sincerely in the inevitable triumph of the democracy in Russia only 15 years ago. So who knows? I'm sorry, I don't have the real answer for your question. Sorry. There is another question.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mikhail, for your wonderful, very interesting talk. I have a question about, you said that Russia experienced wonderful, peaceful years after the collapse of the Soviet Union. In this context,
after year 2000.
In this context, I'm interested in what you think about the two Chechen wars, about the Russo-Georgian War, and about many other conflicts initiated by the Russian state. Not to give some names. So I'm wondering what's the role and the impact of those wars on Russia today. Thank you.
You know, you are absolutely right, but we know that war in Georgia, for example, that's a very good example. War in Georgia was unnoticed by 99.999% of the population of this world. By Russia, but by the West as well. We all remember that the so-called reset and the reset button was pushed. It was, remind me, no, it was invented by Vice President Biden, and for the first time it was announced during the Munich conference in early February. So 6 months after the war, the reset started. And so basically no one paid attention to the war in Georgia. And yes, obviously, for the population of Russia, it was not even a distraction from watching the Olympic Games in Beijing. And it's really sad. That's a tragedy that, you know, I was working as a journalist that time, and I was editing reports from Georgia, and I was covering all those wars. And that time I thought that it is part of a huge problem, and I thought that the problems we're going to have are much worse than those we had that time. But for majority of Russians, that was fat decade. Since the oil prices started skyrocketing in year 2000, the standards of living were better and better. We cannot deny that. We cannot deny that that Russians and we cannot blame them for that, because for the first time in history of the whole country, a lot of people started enjoying their lives. They had the opportunity to go abroad, to Turkey, to Egypt. They had possibility to buy cars, to have mortgages, so on and so forth. Yes, war in Chechnya was something they didn't want to pay attention. The war in Georgia was something they did not mention. They did not notice. And I think a lot of when I was writing All the Kremlin's Men, I was asking most people I was talking to, what was the turning point for Putin, and what was the point of no return, after which all the hopes were eliminated. And you know, I got dozens of answers. Someone told me that Yukos, that was the turning point. Someone told me Beslan. Someone told me Nordost, war in Georgia, assassination of Politkovskaya, explosions of the buildings in Moscow. There were so many turning points. Orange Revolution in Ukraine, definitely. So many turning points. And actually, there were so many bad news for Russia. There were so many bad news for the world that should have made us change our mind. And but a lot of people were intoxicated by wealth, and that's a natural process. That usually happens with the people. So I think the consequences of so not all of those problems were caused by imperial ambitions. Some of them were. Orange Revolution, gas wars against Ukraine. These were caused by Putin's imperial ambitions. But they all had terrible consequences, and altogether, as a puzzle, as a pieces of the puzzle, that's a nightmare. And that brought us here, obviously.
We have time for one last question. Alex?
Thank you for the talk. I had a question about the title of your new book. So for me, it was a pretty apparent mixture of two famous Russian novels, War and Peace by Tolstoy and Crime and Punishment by Dostoevsky. So for me, the way you changed it means that before, so now, since it is the war, the next step should be punishment instead of the peace, which Tolstoy expected, probably. So my question is, first, was it an intentional mix? And the second one is, what you think should follow after the war? First the punishment and only then the peace? Or it should be peace first because the lives of people is more important than punishing the imperialistic ambitions of Russia?
You know, it was not only about that. It was not that straightforward. It was not the scheme of the book. You know, first the war, then the punishment. No, it was. I was deliberately playing with names of those novels because that's the book about Russian culture, and that's the book about Tolstoy and Dostoevsky, and about their legacy, and about their values, and about the fact that we need to, and that's okay, to start asking questions about sacred cows. And that Dostoevsky, for example, was a great author, but terrible person, and his values were close to being fascist. And he really wanted Constantinople to be invaded and to be the capital of Russia. He wanted all Turks to be massacred. He wanted Jews to be. His political views were rather bad. So, and I think we have to think about that. We have to talk about that. We have to talk about Pushkin and Poltava, which is terrible for any Ukrainian reader. We have to think a lot about all Russian authors who wrote about war in Caucasus and about that colonial war in Caucasus in the 19th century. So yes, it was. I specifically used those two brands to start the conversation about Russian culture as something that should not be beyond accusations and beyond our doubts. It's okay to talk about that. I think we must do that. Doesn't mean that they should be canceled, but they should not be sacred cows. I'm happy that Tolstoy is okay. Personally, I prefer I prefer reading Tolstoy to Dostoevsky. Dostoevsky is not my type of writer. I'm happy that Tolstoy was probably the first Russian author to denounce colonial war in Caucasus with Haji Murat. He was against all Russian wars. He was for he wanted Russia to be defeated during the war in Japan, and obviously he inspired Mahatma Gandhi as a philosopher. If we're speaking about the perspective, what's going to happen after the war, actually I'm dreaming of the trial. I don't want them to die. I want the trial. I want to see the trial. It will be great, even if not all of them, even if only Margarita Simonyan or whoever. Yeah, but I think they deserve it. I think that would be that's important to see, to listen to all those hearings in court. And yes, definitely, it's hard to talk about peace because for Ukrainians, we all, I think all of us have a lot of friends in Ukraine. We know different feelings Ukrainians have. You know that on the one hand, a lot of people are exhausted, but also a lot of people cannot tolerate the peace with current borders, and it's going to be a problem for many years. And as for now, we see that Ukrainian politicians cannot accept the beginning of the negotiations with that borders, with that part of Ukraine occupied by Russian troops. So it's a very hard question. Unfortunately, it depends on American political situation as well. Unfortunately, I think that it's not over on the Russian side as well. I know that there is a plan to wait and see, and then to continue the offensive. So I'm afraid that we are going to hear some bad news from Ukraine. Thanks so much. It was a pleasure to talk to you. Thank you for coming.
Thank you very much, Mikhail. Thank you all for coming. And like we said, that Mikhail's agreed to do book signing if people would like to have their book signed as well. Thank you.
Thanks.